Well, now we turn to the text that we're preaching on. If you're just joining us, I've been preaching through the book of Exodus. We took a long break, and now we're back into it. And now we come to this text, this most famous text in Exodus chapter 19. But before we do that, let me pray for us. Great God in heaven, ruler of the nations, creator of all things. For from you and through you and to you are all things, that you might have the glory both now and forever. And we ask that as we open your word, that your word would come in power, that you would deliver it into our hearts by the power of the Spirit, and that it would not return to you void, but it would bear much fruit. Fill this room, Lord, with your knowledge and your glory. And even use me, despite all my insecurity and anxiety and sin. Use me for Christ's sake. Amen. Well, let me ask you a question. What is the church, and why does the church exist? Those are simple questions, basic questions. Maybe we think of them as too basic to even consider, but have you considered them, and can you answer them? Because I think we get confused sometimes. I was riding on a bus, and I just started up a conversation with the fellow next to me. He had come over as a foreign exchange student from China, and he had never been to the Western world before, and he found out that I worked at a church, and so he asked me, so is the church basically like a social club? And I said, well, no, the church isn't like a social club. And I started to explain to him what the church was. And as I did so, I did have to admit that as I was explaining to him, as I was talking to him, I thought to myself, if this guy were to go and visit a church, and if he were to observe why people go to church, not the stated reasons, but why they really go, would he have any reason to believe that this isn't a social club? I kind of worried that he might actually go check it out because I invited him to. Isn't it true that it's easy to forget who we are and what we're about? The church can easily become a group of like-minded people who reinforce each other's preferences and proclivities. A social outlet, an overprogrammed institution that keeps people so busy with lots of good things that they're sheltered from the world around them, a culturally marginalized institution that has really no effect on society. Isn't that so often what we see? What is the church? And why does the church exist? Well, I don't think there's any better place to answer that question than Exodus 19. Exodus 19, verses 3 through 6. I don't make an overstatement when I say that these verses are the most important verses in all of Exodus. And these are perhaps the most important verses for defining who Israel is. They form a hinge from redemption to the people becoming a nation at Sinai and God giving the law, from slavery to nationhood. And here God gives them this declaration. Verse 3, you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell or declare to the people of Israel. It is a declaration, God's declaration of Israel's independence. Their Magna Carta. This is who they are. This is why they exist. And so there's no better place to find out who Israel is, and I think the identity and the mission of the church, than here. But I can hear the objection. I can hear some of you saying, wait, Kyle, hold on a second, but this is talking about Israel, and you're talking about the church, so why would this tell us about the church? That's understandable. I get why you say that. But I quoted it earlier, 1 Peter 2:9. Peter says, to the church in Asia Minor, scattered throughout that region, but you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his, that is God's own possession. In other words, Peter takes the very words that are used here to describe Israel, and he applies them to the church. So, no matter what you think about the convoluted relationship between Israel and the church, one thing is clear. One thing is very clear we must all agree on, and that is this, that the New Testament authors, they thought that the identity and mission of Israel informed the identity and mission of the church. So if we want to know who the church is and why they exist, then we have no better place to look than looking and starting with who Israel is and why they exist. And the first thing that we see here is that the church, like Israel, is redeemed by God. Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the people of Israel, verse 4, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. You have seen, you have experienced the power and the grace of God's redemption. Israel is a people who have been redeemed by the power of God. I don't know if you know this, I didn't until I studied this, but eagles, when they're teaching their children how to fly, it's kind of like how some of you teach your kindergartners how to ride a bike. They just kind of kick them out of the nest. That's how I was taught how to ride a bike, but they just kind of pushed me. Thanks, Pop. But if the bird is not ready to fly, and if it starts floundering and falling and doesn't fly, the eagle swoops under the bird, the mother eagle, and lifts the bird up and soars back and brings the bird back home to its nest. And God says, like a mother eagle rescues its floundering child, so I have rescued you. I have brought you home. I have brought you to myself. Home, home. Home is whenever I'm with you. God has redeemed Israel by his power, and he has redeemed Israel by his grace. Take note, and take note well, that before one law is given, before one stipulation, before Israel does anything, she is redeemed. What did Israel do to earn her salvation? Absolutely nothing. Before she lifted a finger, absolutely nothing. She is a people who have been redeemed by the grace of God. And so too the church. We are a people who have been redeemed by God's power and God's grace. It was before we lifted a finger or even made a twitch to turn towards God that he turned towards us. When we were sinners, that God sent his own son to die for us. And through his death, the power of his death, he canceled sin. And through the power of his resurrection, he brought forth a new creation. The church is a people who have been redeemed by the power and the grace of God. And here we see the first place where I think we get church wrong. Because for many people, the church is a place where? A place where they have memories, nostalgic memories of running under pews or down the halls. A church is a place where they were married. A church is a place where they had their Boy Scouts meetings. A church is a place where nice people and good people and religious people go. But first and foremost, the church is not a place where. The church is not a place where. The church is a people who have been redeemed by God. It is full of ex-slaves. Slaves who have redeemed, slaves to sin, addicts, and God has rescued them. First and foremost, the church is not a place where. The church is a people who have been redeemed by God, just like Israel. And secondly, we see that the church, like Israel, has not only been redeemed by God, but the church, like Israel, also belongs to God. We see it there in verse 5. God goes on to declare this over him. You shall be my treasured possession. Now, the idea of a treasured possession comes from has to do with the personal property of a king or a monarch. You see, back in this day, monarchs owned absolutely everything, including the streets that people walked on and the people themselves. Therefore, if they wanted to put them to death, they could. The king owned everything, but even though the king owned everything, there were certain things within the king's own private, personal treasure that he possessed for himself. The third wealthiest landowner in England is Trinity College, Cambridge. The second wealthiest landowner, most people in England don't own the land that their house is on. They actually just own the building, and they pay taxes to the landowner. The second largest, wealthiest landowner in all of England is the church. And the first wealthiest landowner in all of England is the crown. And some of you probably know that the Queen has many residences, like Buckingham Palace, maybe you've been there, or Windsor Castle. And though she has many residences, there are actually a few residences, well, actually two residences that are not owned by the crown, but they are owned by the royal family personally. So, for instance, Balmoral Castle in Aberdeenshire, where the Queen likes to go and vacation. Not owned by the crown, but still owned by the Queen. It's almost as, even though the Queen owns all this land, and even though she has all these residences, there are certain residences that are part of her personal, private treasure. What this text says is that even though God owns all the nations of the earth, Israel is his personal, private treasure. She has been chosen by God. That's what it means to be a treasured possession. Treasured by God. And so too the church. Peter says, you are a chosen race, a people for God's own possession. And that means at least two things. At first, it means that the church is treasured by God. Treasured possession. That God chose the church, that God elected the church, that the church is special to God, that even God, though God so loved the world, only the church is called his bride. And we're called to love our neighbor, but I don't think we're called to love our neighbor the same way we're called to love our bride. There is a special love that God has for his church. Like that old pair of jeans that you keep going back to, so the church. God loves the church. But it's not just that he treasures the church, it also means that the church exists for God. Treasured possession. To be a possession is to belong to, for the pleasure of, for the use of. And the church is God's treasured possession. It belongs to God, exists for him. And here we see another common misunderstanding about the church. If you were to ask people, Christians and non-Christians, what is the church? Most of their answers are going to say something like this. The church is a place where I or others go to get their needs met. The church is a place where I go to get religious, spiritual goods and services. The church is the place where I go to get my word for the week. The church is the place where I go to get me through my mucky Mondays. The church is the place where I go to help raise my kids. The church is the place where I go to find a spouse or business connections. The church is the place where I go to meet my needs. But if the church belongs to God, if the church exists for God, then the church is not there to meet my needs or your needs. Not first and foremost. The church exists for God, for his honor, for his praise, for his glory, for his purposes in the world. You see, the church is not a place where. The church is not a place where I go to get my needs met. The church is a people who have been called out by God. Called out for God. Those of you who are West Wing fans will remember the scenes. Leo McGarry, who is the chief of staff often has to make he has to execute difficult decisions, sometimes decisions he doesn't even agree with, on behalf of the president. And when he's challenged, he's fond of saying something to the effect of, "I serve at the pleasure of the president." In other words, what he's saying is my whole job, my whole role, what I do, everything that I do, it exists for the pleasure of the president. Brothers and sisters, you and I, we exist for the pleasure of the King of the universe. Our very existence is for him, for his honor, for his glory, for his purposes. Well, what would it look like to serve God's purposes? What would it look like to live for God's purposes? Well, that's where we get to this final declaration of who Israel is and who the church is. See, the church, like Israel, not only is redeemed by God, the church, like Israel, not only belongs to God, but finally, the church, like Israel, is commissioned by God. And why did God choose Israel? What is so special about Israel? Why does he call Israel his treasured possession? Well, let me answer that by starting with another question. Why, in the midst of a declaration about Israel being his treasured possession, does God feel it necessary to reinstate the idea that, verse 5, all the earth is his? Why does he need to do that? And what is the significance of that word for? For all the earth is mine. Well, for is a connecting word. But what's the connection between Israel being his possession, my treasured possession, and the earth being his possession? All the earth is mine. Same construction in the Hebrew. What is the connection here? Well, the answer to this perplexing question is found there in verse 6, where it goes on to call Israel a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. A holy nation. A nation. A nation means that is to have international ramifications and relationships. Nations relate with other nations and they are recognized as such, but not just a nation, a holy nation. To be holy, in the idea of the Bible, just means to be set apart, to be distinct, to be peculiar, to be strange, odd. We're living up to that. What does it mean that Israel, though, is a holy nation? Holy, distinct, in what way? Well, distinct in that she is to be as distinct as the character of her God. You shall be holy to me, God says in Leviticus 20:26, for I, the Lord, am holy. Holy like God, and have separated you from the peoples that you should be mine. Israel is to be as distinct as the God who saved her, but not distinct for herself, distinct for others. See, because the text also calls her a kingdom of priests. Now let's just think about that for a second. What do priests do? Well, commonly people know that what the priests did is they led the people in worship. They prayed on behalf of the people. They represented them to God, like the high priest who took the stones of the tribes of Israel and he wore them and he went into the Holy of Holies, representing the people and bringing them to God. That's what priests did. And priests brought the sacrifices of the people, the sacrifices that the people themselves identified with, and he brought them and he sacrificed these sacrifices to God. A priest is someone who represents the people to God. He brings the people to God. Leviticus 1-7, if you've ever read through it, it details this in minutia. But that's not all the priests did. You know, the priests also taught. In fact, the priests, not the prophets, were the primary teachers of Israel. We don't think about priests as teachers because none of their sermons are recorded, but that's exactly what they did. Malachi 2:7, for the lips of a priest should guard knowledge, and the people should seek instruction from his mouth. For he, that is the priest, is the messenger of the Lord of hosts. That's the primary job of the priest. That he would explain the law to people, that he would communicate to the people all that God had revealed himself to be. In other words, the priest not only brought the people to God, he also brought God and the knowledge of God to the people. He was an intermediary. And so too Israel. When the Bible calls Israel a kingdom of priests, by the way, not a New Testament concept, the priesthood of all of Israel and the priesthood of all believers, this is where it comes from. It meant that Israel as a nation was to bring the nations to God by praying for the nations, by bringing them to God in their worship, by bringing them to worship, which is why throughout books like Isaiah, we see the kings of the earth flocking to the temple to worship God, which is why there was a Gentile court on the outside of the temple for the nations to come and worship. Israel was to be a people who represented the nations to God. But they were also to bring God to the nations. You shall be my light. You shall be my light, God says. Israel was to reveal to the nations the character of God and all that he had revealed himself to be, particularly in their distinct way of life. This is who Israel was. And Israel was to do one more thing that the priests did. They were to bless the people. In keeping with that great promise to Abraham, where God said, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great. Why? So that you will be a blessing, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So too Israel. You see, God's purposes with Israel, they didn't stop with Israel. God's purposes for Israel were bound up with his purposes for the world. Now, can you see it? Can you see it? Can you see why God says, for all the earth is mine? After saying that Israel is his treasured possession. Can you see it? See, it is precisely because all the earth is the Lord's that God made Israel his treasured possession. Well, let me put it another way. God made Israel his treasured possession precisely because he treasured the world. You see, God has had one goal, one overarching goal from the very beginning. And that goal is best summed up in Habakkuk 2:14. His goal is that the earth should be filled with the knowledge and the glory of God as the waters cover the sea. Now picture that image. How do the waters cover the sea? Completely. And God's goal is that the entire earth, wherever the earth is, would be full of people who know him and glorify him and worship him. This has been God's goal since the very beginning. This is why God said to Adam, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. He is saying, go be my representative to the whole world. Fill the earth with worshipers of me. And God was not thwarted by our sin. When humanity rebelled against God, God stuck to the mission. He is still on track. He is still going to make sure that all the earth is filled with his knowledge and glory as the waters cover the sea. And he's going to use Israel to do it. You see, if God called Israel, it was so that Israel might, or through Israel, he might call the world. If God redeemed Israel, it was so that through Israel he might redeem the world. If God blessed Israel so that through Israel he might bless the world. If God chose Israel, it was for the world's sake. So too the church. For you are a chosen race. You are a royal priesthood. You are a holy nation. See, God so loved the world that he chose the church. If God has blessed the church, then it's that she might bless the world. If God has redeemed the church, it's so that through the church he might redeem the world. God has called, chosen, and blessed the church so that he might call, choose, and bless the world. This is God's purpose. Consequently, this is where most of our discussions, or a lot of them historically, about the doctrine of election have missed the boat. Now, before I say this, let me make something very clear. I don't believe that I could have lifted one finger towards God if he hadn't pursued me in love. There's no way I would have chosen God had he not chosen me first. There is no way I would have loved God if his love hadn't awakened love in me. There is no way. But we see here that fundamentally that God choosing Israel is not just choosing her for her own salvation. And God choosing the church is not just choosing the church for its own salvation. You see, God chose, called, saved Israel. God chose, called, saved the church so that through them he might save the world. Election is about mission. Election is about mission. The church is not a place where. The church is not a place where. The church is a people who have been called out by God to be sent out for God so that God might be known and glorified through the entire earth. Now, do you see how big our mission is? Do you see how big our mission is? We exist. We, you and I, exist so that God might be known and glorified in Egypt. We exist so that God might be known and glorified in the Ukraine. We exist so that God might be known and glorified in Germany. We exist so that God might be known and glorified in Cambodia, in North Korea, and yes, even in Santa Barbara. This is why we exist. This is why God has saved you. This is why he has called you to himself. That he might use you to call the world. Now that is a big vision. That is a big vision, and it is glorious, and it is biblical, and because it is biblical, it is true. And let's be honest, it's a bit overwhelming. It is a bit overwhelming. Are you feeling overwhelmed? I hope so. Actually, I'm not worried about you feeling overwhelmed. We should feel overwhelmed with how big the task is. We should feel overwhelmed so that we know that we need to lean on God. So that we're caught up in something bigger than our own needs and our own problems and the hangnails that we have. We need a big vision. We need to set our horizons far and wide. But I don't want to leave you overwhelmed. I don't want to leave you overwhelmed, and so what I want to do is to talk about some tangible ways in which maybe this vision can actually be worked out in our lives. That's where I want to end. Some practical application. Let's put some feet on this thing. Let's bring it down to earth. What does it mean to be a royal priesthood? How are we going to live into this calling? Well, if we are going to live in this calling, if we are going to be a royal priesthood, then we must expand our vision of what God is doing in the world. We must expand our vision of God, what God is doing in the world. You say, well, how do I do that? Well, here's how you do it. Start with the Bible and meditate on the texts that talk about the nations coming to worship God. Meditate on texts like Psalm 67, which say, be gracious to us, O God, and bless us, and God make his face to shine upon us, that your way may be known on earth, and your saving power among all nations. Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you, and let the nations be glad. Psalm 67. Or Psalm 72, which picture the kings of the earth bringing their tributes in, their cultures, and worshiping King Jesus, because he is a righteous ruler. Or texts like Isaiah 25, which speak of a feast that God is preparing on the mountain of the Lord, a feast of rich food and well-aged wine for all peoples. Can you imagine that feast? Or Isaiah 66, where God calls to the earth and he says, come to me and be saved, all the ends of the earth. Or the glorious visions in Revelation of a pan-national community from every tongue and tribe and nation falling down at the throne of the Lamb and worshiping him. Meditate. And then, as you watch the Olympics, and you see the various countries of the world represented, pray for them. Find out what God is doing there. Expand your vision. That's the first thing that we need. That's where we need to start. We need to start just with an expanded vision. So go to places like the joshuaproject.net and look up and see this project exists to talk about what people groups in the world are the least, have the fewest followers of Jesus. Go look at that. So we think that it's important that we as a congregation expand our vision. And so here's what else you can do. I want you to mark your calendars for Sunday, June 8th, and that evening. It's Pentecost Sunday. There's no better time to expand our vision. And so the Global Outreach team, they are going to put on a gala for you all to come, and so that we can have our visions expanded about what God is doing in the world. Come see how the Spirit is at work in the whole world. If we're going to live into this calling, we have to do this. Another thing that you do is consider a short-term mission trip like Buck. Yeah, short-term trips, they can have their negative impacts. I'm not denying that, and all missiologists and sociologists know that. But one of the positive impacts that they can have is that they expand our vision. So think about expanding your vision through something like that. If we're going to live in this calling as to be a royal priesthood, we have to expand our vision. But second, we have to participate with others in God's mission. See, that we want to be aware and become more and ever increasingly aware of what God is doing throughout the world, we also want to develop relationships, deep, intimate partnerships with Christians around the world to see what God is doing there. That we could actually tell the story in the narrative of what's happening on the ground. And to do that, you need more than just a snippet here or there. You actually have to be in close, deep fellowship with these people with specific works. So figure out how to do that. Correspond individually with Christians around the world. You can't do it with everyone. Pick a few, and follow them closely. Because you're not going to know what's going on in the details of the story with 100 people. Pick a few. And community group leaders, consider this. Consider that we want our community groups to be in deeper relationships with our global partners, corresponding with them, loving them, praying for them. Consider how you might do this as community groups. This is what participation looks like. Participation also looks like giving generously. See, because God is on the move around the world. He's on the move especially in places like Africa, and places like South America, and places like China. But you know what? He has blessed us in the Western world richly, and we have a lot of the resources. I will never forget the day I was worshiping at this Anglican church in St. Louis. The reason I was there is that they were having actually an ordination of a priest, but this Anglican church had put themselves under the Bishop of Rwanda because they were conservative and evangelical, and they wanted a conservative evangelical bishop. So, but to ordain in the Anglican church, the bishop actually has to come do the ordination. So they had to fly this guy from Rwanda to actually perform this ordination. And as he sat there in this church in suburban St. Louis, is sitting there, this wealthy church, that they're dependent on this African bishop to ordain their ordinand. But this African bishop looks at them and he says this, you need my help because you need me to ordain your ordinand. But you know what? We need your help because we have house churches, like home groups that are 900 people. 900 people. 900-person home groups. And they don't have a priest or anyone who could come and teach them. Because the priests, they can't travel out there, so they need scooters. So if you could please donate $250 to $500, we can start buying these priest scooters so they can make it to these house churches that are anywhere from 100 to 900 people. Home groups. You thought your home group was large. Home groups. So that they can minister to the people and teach them. We have a lot of resources, and we need to send those resources out. We need to give generously. We have other resources as well. We have theological resources because of our existence, because the Lord has been at work in the gospel for so long in the intellectual tradition of the church in the West. We have many theological resources that they don't have in other parts of the world. This is why people like Richard Pratt has devoted his whole life as a seminary professor. He left teaching at Reformed Theological Seminary, and now all he does is he translates materials and sends them out for free to the church around the world. 7 of the largest, of the most used languages in the world, they're translating materials and just getting them out for free. We have a wealth, and we have to give generously. Participation means developing relationships. Participation means giving generously. If we are going to live into this calling, we have to participate with others in God's mission. And if we are going to live into this calling of being a royal priesthood, we must remember our own place in the mission. You have been called to call, blessed to bless, and elected for the world's sake. Is that how you think of yourself? Is that how you think of yourself? Because I got to be honest, let's be honest, it's easy to forget. And when we forget that we have been chosen so that through us we might bless the world, when we forget that, here's what it looks like. When we forget our mission, when we forget who we are, we become apathetic about non-Christians. But we stop saying, come and see. We stop pursuing them and saying, come, see. We are a royal priesthood. We should be bringing the people to God. But we stop showing them hospitality. When we forget, it looks like coming late to service. Because you know who doesn't show up late to services? Visitors. When visitors come, they're here early. And when you're not here, you can't greet them and welcome them as God in Christ has welcomed you. And you know how he did that? He didn't show up late. He showed up early. While we were sinners, Christ died for us. At the fullness of time, God sent his Son for us. We show up early and we stay late and we pursue people that we don't know. And we don't just pursue them after the service. We pursue them throughout the week. We continue to love them. We say, I've been blessed to bless you. When we forget, we stop saying, come and see. When we forget, we stop going and telling. You see, it's not only that the nations were drawn into the worship of the people of God, it's that the people of God are supposed to send the light of God out to the nations. We forget going and telling. We forget that we should have a burden, a deep burden for people, because as much as it pains me to say this, and as unpopular as it is, the reality is without Jesus, our friends are without hope. Hell's a reality. Hell's a reality. It's a reality because, and if it wasn't, why did God send his Son? Why did he send his Son to experience it for you and for me? As much as it pains me to say it, without Jesus, they're without hope. And so we have to go and tell and share the light of the gospel about the God who accepts people and loves them because of grace. We stop being burdened for unbelievers. We become apathetic about them. And when we forget, it looks like thinking that Jesus is a means to our ends. Let's be honest. It's easy to think that Jesus is a means to our ends. That Jesus is there for our comfort, for our satisfaction, for our happiness, for our eternal security. But first and foremost, Jesus is not a means to our ends. We are a means to Jesus' ends. We have been called that through us, God might fill the earth with his knowledge and glory. That is why we exist. This is who we are. And that means our mentality about church, it has to change. And the criteria by which we evaluate ministries has to change. We can no longer look at ministries and say, is this meeting my need? And if it is, then I'll like it and go to church. If this meeting my needs, then I will. Or is it not? No, we have to ask, is this glorifying God? And is it glorifying God by fulfilling His purposes, ultimately, to fill the earth with His knowledge and glory? And if it isn't, let's scrap it. Let's scrap it. Even the things that I'm fond of. Even the ways of doing things that I'm fond of. Let's all agree right now that we will scrap it. Because it's not about our preferences. It's not about our proclivities. It's not about Jesus being a means to our ends. It's about us being called to be means to His ends. That He might be worshipped and glorified in all the earth. Don't forget who you are. Chosen people. Royal priesthood. Holy nation. Don't forget your mission. Called to call. You are a royal priesthood. You are. If you obey. Did you notice that? There's a line that I missed. I skipped it when talking through. I don't know if you saw it, but it's there in verse 5. He says, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession. If you indeed will obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be a kingdom of priests. If you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be a holy nation. If you obey. Now don't misread this, because I know how you want to read this, and you want to read this in a certain way, and I know the way is this, because it's the way that every other religion and philosophy and social movement and everything else in the world thinks. We want to read this as saying, if we obey, then we will be saved. They are already saved. They are already saved. They are saved by the grace of God. This is not a condition for salvation. Hear that. We are saved by the grace of God. This is not a condition for salvation, but it is a condition for becoming effective in our mission. If you will obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you will be a kingdom of priests. It is a condition for that. And what does it mean to obey? Well, notice that there have been no laws given yet. Not one stipulation. No, we're just called to obey His voice and keep His covenant, which the only covenant that's been mentioned thus far is the covenant God made with Abraham, that He would bless Abraham to bless the world. In other words, what is required is an unqualified commitment to God and whatever He says and wherever He takes us. See, it is a lot easier sometimes to obey laws than to obey a person. But this our mission, it grows out of a deep, vibrant relationship with God if you will obey my voice. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, being a Christian is less about cautiously avoiding sin than about courageously and actively doing God's will. Courageously and actively being on mission for God. So let me ask you a question that I've had to ask myself this week. Do you ever wonder why we're not more effective, and do you ever think that we should be in our mission? Do you ever think that we should be more of a presence and blessing to this community and this city than we are? Could it be? This is a hard question. It's the question I had to ask myself. Could it be that the reason we're not is because we are not wholeheartedly committed to God and His mission? Could it be that the reason that we're not is because I am not wholeheartedly committed to God and His mission and willing to do what is required? See, if we are not wholeheartedly committed, we will not be effective. But you know who is wholeheartedly committed to God and His mission? God. Because even though Israel failed, When God called Israel to himself to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, even though they failed to wholeheartedly obey him, do you know what God did? He sent the one true Israelite, his son, who obeyed to the utmost. And you know what he did? When he ascended on high, he sent forth his Spirit. And he said, I have made you a light to the nations. That's what Paul and Barnabas rejoice and say in Acts chapter 11 or 13. You see, God is committed. And at the end of the story, you know what we see? We see that he fulfills his purpose. That there is a pan-national community and that the whole earth is filled with the knowledge and glory of God as the waters cover the sea. He will not fail. He will not fail. And he's committed to doing it through you and me. As I watched the opening ceremonies, it was just amazing. I really actually Pam suggested that we watch it, and I was kind of like, that sounds boring. Why do that? I'm just being honest. But as I watched it, it was great to see all these different people in the different nations and them coming through and their smiles. And they were so excited. But you know who else is? It was kind of interesting to see. Did you notice how satisfied Vladimir Putin looked when he stood up and he said, let the games begin? You know, he had brought the nations to Russia. He had accomplished it. And they were all there and they were coming through and they were smiling. Well, as I thought about that, I said, you know, I'm looking forward to another opening ceremonies. When God will stand before the world and he will be satisfied because the earth will be full of the knowledge of God and the glory of God as the waters cover the sea. And the nations, they will be glad and they will rejoice. They will rejoice at what God has done. See, he will not fail. And he is committed. And you know what else? He's committed to doing it through you and me. So you can take that as a promise that he will make you into what he has called you to be. Royal priesthood, holy nation. God, we ask that you would make us into all that you have called us to be. That we might proclaim the excellencies of you who have called us, and that through that you might call others to yourself. Amen.